Welcome to Nighttime Logic. We're starting just a few seconds early. Nighttime Logic is the places or parts of a story that are felt, but not necessarily consciously processed. It's also the name of our series tonight. It is Thursday, June 26, 2025. I'm coming at you from New York, where the heat dome just passed. But welcome to the Summer of Liminal Space mini-series. It's this 4-part summer series that's going to be focusing on the strange, the liminal, the horrific, and the uncanny in fiction. And tonight I'm here with authors Rebecca Cuthbert, Scotty Milder, and Joshua Rex, and we're going to talk about strange tales in fiction, and we're going to hear them read from their work. And before I introduce everybody, the rough structure tonight is I'm going to talk about the liminal. I'm going to talk a question about the ambiguous, and I'll talk put a topic out there of a sense of place for the panel, and we'll hear a story during each section of that from everyone. So welcome, everyone. Hi, Rebecca. Hello. Hi, Scotty. Hi, Joshua. Hello. How are you all?
Good, Daniel. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Let me introduce everyone here. Rebecca Cuthbert writes dark fiction and poetry. She loves ghost stories, folklore, witchy women, and anything that involves nature getting revenge. Her titles include In Memory of Exoskeletons, which is poetry, Creep This Way, a nonfiction work, Self-Made Monsters, Down in the Dark Deep Where Puddlers Dwell, and 6 O'Clock House and Other Strange Tales, which are short stories. Her author website for free stories and more is at Rebecca Cuthbert Writes, and you can find that introduction and everything on our story notes. Welcome, Rebecca. How are you today?
Hello, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Oh, it's great to have you. Scotty Milder is a writer, filmmaker, and film educator living in Albuquerque, New Mexico. He's received his MFA in screenwriting from Boston University, and his award-winning short films have screened at festivals all over the world, including CineQuest, the Dead by Dawn Festival of Horror, Holly Shorts, and the H.P. Lovecraft Film Festival and CthulhuCon. His independent feature film, Dead Billy, is available to stream on Amazon Prime and Google Play. But Scotty's also an author. He sold over 50 short stories, and his fiction has appeared in Dark Matter Magazine, Cosmic Horror Monthly, Dark Moon Digest, and anthologies, including from Dark Peninsula Press, Sinister Smile Press, Dark Ink Books, and others. He teaches screenwriting and film production at Santa Fe Community College and the University of New Mexico, and he's the host of the Horror from the High Desert podcast, which should be long-time people who tune in. Shouldn't be a stranger to that. And he's a co-host of The Weirdest Thing, the history podcast with actor and theater artist Amelia make sure I got her name right. Ampuero. Thank you so much. Welcome, Scotty. Great.
Yeah, thanks.
Great to have you on the show. I know I've been on your show quite a few times, so it's really wonderful to have you on this side of the camera here.
Yeah.
And great to see you. Joshua Rex is an American author of speculative fiction and historian of Victorian America. He's the author of the novel A Mighty Word from Rotary Press, the novella The Inamorata from Weird House Press, and 5 collections. His short fiction has appeared in McSweeney's, Nightscript, Pseudopod, Tales to Terrify, Conphonic Matter, Nightscript, and others. Joshua, what is the full name of your most recent short story collection?
It's Haunted Victorian America Ghost Stories.
Haunted Victorian America Ghost Stories. And Joshua is also a podcaster. I know I've been on the other side of the camera or the other side of the microphone with you, so it's also wonderful to have you here. Everyone, welcome to Joshua Rex. How are you, Joshua?
Great to see you, Daniel. Thanks so much for having me.
Thank you to you three. Let's get right into the topic of the day. Look, let's face it. Something's up when I'm on the right side of the zeitgeist. That zeitgeist, we were talking a bit about it as we were getting ready, of liminal space. I have a new book out. It's called Creatures of Liminal Space. And, that name has been around as a manuscript for quite some time, quite longer before I knew that liminal space was actually like a thing, and not just like a thing like as like a funny, non-marketable, anti-zeitgeist name of one of my projects. So I just looked up a quick internet search, and liminal space. There's like the internet, and it's all infinite wisdom or not wisdom. Says liminal space. There's an internet aesthetic of what you call liminal space. There's a psychological liminal space, and then there's liminality in general. And I find that really fascinating, particularly the internet aesthetic, that it's just like a thing that people are interested in. It's just so surprising to me.
Yeah.
I'm so much more interested in the psychological aspect of what people call liminal space and also liminality in general. But today, I think I want to hear from the panel. The first topic, I'll throw that out to the panel to tell me what you think about any of those three. But also, let's talk about. First, I'll ask you about these concepts of those three concepts of liminality, and I'll ask you a follow-up question because it could be a big mouthful about what liminal space or liminality might mean in fiction. So, over to Rebecca. The concept of liminality. What does it mean to you? What do you think about it? Or what's on your mind with that?
Well, it's a big question.
It is a big question, right?
Big concept. But part of it for me, I mean, it's obviously these in-between spaces. So I think it has so much to do with a setting, but I also think that there is a crossover or sort of a Venn diagram doubling up of these physical liminal spaces and psychological, because there's something too that feels impermanent or sort of half real about these places. And for folks joining us, when we were getting ready for the broadcast, we were talking about hotels and how hotels can be these really strange liminal spaces. They always mean something different to everyone who comes into them. Everyone there is kind of coming or going, that they themselves, like hotels are nowhere. They're there, but they are nowhere. They're just these in-between stopovers for people coming from something or going to something else. And as such, they're a teeny bit creepy. I mean, when you are just kind of at a conference like StokerCon and it's late at night and you're trying to sleep in this bed that's not yours, it gets worse if you start thinking about how many people have slept in that bed, how many people have looked at that spot on the wall trying to fall asleep. It makes it much harder to fall asleep.
So before we throw the question on to the rest of the panel, I'm not. I did run into Rebecca at not this past convention, but AuthorCon over in what state is AuthorCon in?
Virginia.
In Virginia, and I think it's okay to say that you and another one of our colleagues, Jamie, were dressed up at one point as two characters from a very famous hotel in a movie that I didn't really think about it as being liminal space until you mentioned there. That's Stephen King's The Shining. In both I knew that the work was inspired by the real hotel. So yeah, I mean, it just shows how liminality in that way. At the very least is atmospheric. At the very least is creepy and could really dovetail really well with the supernatural. Let's move it over to Scotty and your thoughts on liminality and liminal space.
Well, to kind of build on what Rebecca is saying, I mean, liminality is all. I looked up the definition before we were going to talk, and it's the technical definition is a rite of passage. But to broaden it out from there, it really is. It's a threshold. It's all about crossing some sort of barrier between like the place of comfort that you're in into this like place of the unknown. And I was thinking about the first time I encountered the term liminality was actually when I was at Boston University, and I had this screenwriting professor who was a real crazy man. But he also had these like really interesting ideas, and he was telling us about liminality, and to demonstrate his point, he was sitting on the edge of his desk, and there was this kind of like metal, I think it was like a microphone stand sitting next to him on the desk, and he just shoved it off the desk. And he was like, and we all kind of jumped in our seats. And he said, that's liminality. He says, the moment between when I shoved it and when it hit the floor, that's liminality. It's because there's that moment of like my palm hitting the thing, you sitting there being like, wait, what? And then it hits the ground. That transition, that threshold, that is liminality. Because you don't know what's gonna happen.
I love that you said. I love that you said that, Scotty. And I feel like if it's safe to say, I might even love that crazy man of your teacher for saying it too, because I literally was like not today years old, but I was today weeks old. Like it was just this week when I was talking to a friend about this series and about liminality, and they were totally familiar about it. They had encountered it in school. I had not. I'm like, wait, this is a thing. This is a thing that respected, quote unquote, people talk about in school. Why did I miss out on all of this? But I like that definition because it does dovetail to at least what I think is something vital in fiction. When you said it's a threshold, it's between two places. I feel like that it's dovetailing with what I think makes great dramatic structure, which is conflicts and choices. Well, so if you're looking at it in fiction and these characters are at a threshold, they're at a place of making a choice, they're between one or two places, that's where the good stuff in fiction and film is. Static characters in safe places on one shore or the other. It's those rough seas that make for the interesting stuff.
And I think part of what I loved about his example was that liminality, it's not just about crossing from one place to another, but it's going from somewhere that seems ordered and kind of normal, quote unquote normal, into somewhere that's potentially chaotic and dangerous. And that's part of the liminality, is it's like it's going into the unknown, and the unknown is potentially threatening or weird. And we're here to talk about weird fiction. So another space that I think of as liminality is a ringing telephone. Particularly if you don't know the number, like your phone rings and you're like, who is this on the other end of the phone? Because this could just be a spam call, but this could be someone calling to tell you like a loved one is dead.
Is it the lady or the tiger? Is it a spam, or is it like, we bought your manuscript, get ready for success?
Yeah, Scotty. This could be good news or this could be devastating news. But it's that moment before you answer the phone. That's liminality to me. It's not the news itself. It's that space between. It's that threshold between the knowing and the not knowing.
Joshua is not a stranger to the weird. And particularly in his most recent book, to ghost stories and lots of spaces. Let's throw it over to Joshua. How do you relate? What are your thoughts on just in general the concept of liminality?
I really like how you've all expanded on the definition of it. I mean, traditionally, I've sort of thought of it as something that's sort of like in between waking and dreaming, or sleep and dreaming or something. But I really like what Rebecca's saying about hotel rooms in particular, and hotels, certainly liminal spaces. And then I love how Scotty's talking about, that moment when the phone rings, that could be anyone. I mean, it is that in-between state, and sometimes you just want to delay those sort of things as long as you can, especially if you're expecting maybe a bad call or something. And then I really like how you're talking about plot also, Daniel. We kind of purposely put these characters into these situations, and whatever it is between the beginning and end of the story, it almost is itself. The story is a liminal space. I kind of tend to think of life itself as liminal, between birth and death. And I know that sounds pretty general, but it does seem like there are a lot of surprises. You never know really what's coming, and we are sort of just running until we don't know when we'll end. And I think also this maybe goes in hand with maybe the corporeal notion of, pleasure and suffering. Like Daniel mentioned, I'm a historian of Victorian America, and so I do a lot of primary source research. In particular, I'm the historian of the Rutherford B. Hayes Presidential Library and Museums in Fremont, and I'm doing some research right now on Fanny Arabella Hayes Platt, who's Rutherford's only sister. And she talks about, after losing her only child, that reflecting on this, how pleasure and suffering kind of go hand in hand. And so I think maybe there's that notion mentally and physically that we're sort of always in these liminal states, and we never know when we might bounce back and forth from one to the other.
Wow, I mean, we're gonna have to come back and do an entire episode just on liminality, because I don't want to stop talking about it in general, but I'm going to move it on, and we'll just go in reverse. We'll start with Joshua. How, and we've already started talking a little bit about it, about how liminality expresses itself, or how is it used in fiction? I mean, the obvious thing that just coming to mind about your most recent book, Joshua, is you said, yeah, like life is liminal between birth and death, and I could see life as being liminal, and ghost stories are just naturally, inherently, whether we call it by that name or not, are very liminal. But how do you look at liminality or liminal space in fiction in general?
Well, I mean, the ghost story in particular, I think, is frightening because it's ghosts, because it's the unknown. But I think maybe far more frightening to a lot of aspects has to do with the fact of potentially becoming a ghost in a liminal space like that. And, you know, living your course of your life and then having maybe no parameters or no definition to even an end is a pretty terrifying notion. And I think that authors that create ghost stories that are really effective understand that notion, and they're really playing on that as much as possible, because it's scary to us, but we have a way out, as it were, where they don't.
I think it was author Steve Tem, or Steve Resnick Tem, at one conversation we had, where he was like, every human story is a ghost story. And I feel like that just dovetails so nicely with, I think, that's the psychological aspect of liminal space. You know, when I was thinking about liminal spaces, oh, that might be something to describe my work, or that might be something to describe work. Yeah, I thought about it more of, or not more, I was thinking about it only in that concept of the psychological liminality of characters on the precipice of change, of characters making choices. But it's so rich that it encompasses so much. It encompasses that, and it encompasses so much more in fiction. How do you see it in fiction, Scotty? Be it used or as a writer or as a reader?
I mean, particularly in weird fiction, you know, we talk about the idea of the uncanny, you know, the idea of things being strangely familiar or a little bit off. And it is that, like, putting a character in a place where they're about to cross that threshold into, like, something unknown. And, you know, and I know it's a thing, Daniel, you and I have talked about, you know, weird fiction, and particularly that Aikman influence that we both like, and also you know, cosmic horror and a lot of the sort of the classic horror, classic weird fiction. And again, you know, obviously the ghost story, as Joshua was talking about, of you know, kind of exploring that idea of not of the, you know, not the monster kind of like coming right at you, or you know, sort of the classic monster story or whatever, but that idea of, like, where is the threat, you know, the hidden threat, something that is like maybe just around the corner. So exploring the idea of not knowing where the danger is, or not knowing where the threat is, and the threat, and, you know, so it's like that moment of stepping across the threshold rather than being beyond the threshold where we know where the threat is. So it's in that sense, it's kind of classic suspense in that way.
Yeah, I'm glad that you mentioned the classics. Certainly cosmic horror, I feel like I'm not super educated on it, but certainly when we're talking about extra dimensional or crossing over things. But when you mentioned that, it immediately came to mind was Algernon Blackwood's The Willows, which is maybe one of the original Strange Tale, or the original weird fiction, or in many ways a great thing to talk about when talking about quiet horror, in that it's not a monster story. It's very much horror, but it's very much you know, the ancestor of that kind of thing that could very easily be looked at through the lens of liminality. But over to Rebecca. Liminality in fiction. What do you think about it?
Well, first, Scotty, when you brought up the uncanny, and, you know, I always I'm a teacher, so I'm always thinking about what I draw on the board. You know, the two mountains of safety and danger, and here's the uncanny valley, and this is what it is. And I'm thinking about not even being down in the middle of the uncanny valley, but I'm thinking about in fiction a moment that I love, whether I'm writing it or reading it, which is the first step down.
Mm-hmm.
Right? That moment when something is just a little bit off, it makes, I'm like getting a chill thinking of it. It's like when like a piano hits a wrong note, like it's the first wrong note, right? Everything's fine. And then something can be so tiny, just this small shift, and all of a sudden everything stops, you know? The example I always give my students is picture you hanging out with your best friend who you've known for decades. You know them inside and out. One day you're hanging out and all of a sudden their laugh is wrong. Mm-hmm. It is not their laugh, right? And it would freeze the world for you, you know? And then the descent into the uncanny valley, it speeds up from there. Yeah. And that's where we get into, you know, a lot more of the more dramatic story events. But I was also thinking about how with the ambiguity, that's what pulls readers in. That when we do have like strange tales, and when we do have the uncanny, when we do have liminal spaces, that it draws the reader in and it does not let them read passively. You know, it's not quite a fourth wall break, right? But it draws them in because they're being forced to participate, even if they're being forced by their discomfort to participate.
I love that, because it explains so much about my observations about why. Again, I'm just making conjecture here, but that's such a insightful explanation as to why some readers like the strange tales or the ambiguities and some don't. And it's perfectly fine. But I feel like a strange tale, you need to meet it on its side of the line. Yeah. And some readers, some people very close to me, you know, Dance for Me story, you meet me here. You come on the other side of the line and deliver it to me. And that's perfectly fine, but I'm so much more interested on that, where the story becomes you have to interact with it more. And speaking of that kind of stories, let's turn it over to Scotty in just a minute. But Scotty, can you introduce to me? You're going to read from us from one of your strange tales, one of your stories that has a bunch of liminality in it. So tell us what we're about to hear from.
Yeah, so this is a story. This is a little bit of an older story. It's called "It Stares at Me." This was originally published in the Horror USA Washington anthology from Sotira Press.
And you can find you guys can find that link to most of the things we're talking about in the show notes on that Facebook page. Some links are in there.
Yeah, and this was from March of 2020, I believe, is when this was published. And full disclosure, the title "It Stares at Me." This comes from a song from the heavy metal band Pelican. So, all
right, let's turn it over to Scotty.
Yeah. So a little bit of just back. I'm going to read the end of the story. So a little bit of background of what's going on in the story. The story is about a woman named Tori. She's a singer for a heavy metal band called Rat Nation. She has suffered a loss. And her band is on tour in Washington State, and she has kind of abandoned the rest of her band members and has gone to the Hoh National Forest. She's left the rest of the band behind, and she's gone off to the Hoh National Forest. She is someone also, just so you know, that she experiences synesthesia. She can actually see her own emotions as colors. And she's kind of gone on this hike into the Hoh National Forest to find a place that it's actually a real place. It's called 1 Square Inch of Silence. That is a very liminal space in the Hoh National Forest, or the Hoh Rainforest, I think is what it's called. I do want to give a little bit of a content warning for the story. It does involve the death of a child, and it does involve some issues around suicide. Or suicidal ideation. So here we go. The redstone was where all the websites said it would be, sitting in the center of a big fallen log. Someone had scraped some of the moss away so anyone coming by wouldn't miss it. The stone was supposed to be exactly 1 inch square. The actual name of the place was 1 Square Inch of Silence, but she thought it looked bigger than that. And it certainly wasn't square, more of a rough trapezoid, tapering into an almost pyramidal point. And it was more rust-colored than actual red. She knew that sometimes people took the stone and replaced it with another. She wouldn't be doing that. This might be kind of a dick move, she thought as she shrugged the backpack off her shoulders and set it onto the log next to the stone. This was meant to be a place of peace, of refuge, and after what she was about to do, it would no longer be that at all. And it was conceivable that her few but dedicated fans would finish the job she started, traipsing out here with candles of a tribute, carving words into the log with pocket knives. R.I.P. Torquemada forever, metal never dies, that sort of thing. Maybe she should wander off a little ways, find another tree, do it there. She looked at the stone, imagined for a moment that someone had left it there just for her, and decided she didn't really give a shit. She wasn't sure she'd ever made a mark on the world. She'd tried to do it with her music, but knew she was never really good enough. She thought she had with Dax, but that had been taken away from her, so by God, she was going to do it now. She opened the backpack and she took out the Nalgene bottle. It was half full, the water lukewarm. She considered eating a protein bar and decided against it. She didn't think it would interfere with the oxy, but better safe than sorry. She pulled out the wrapped bundle at the bottom of the bag and sat it cross-legged on the ground, leaning back against the log. She opened the towel, considered the straight razor for a moment, then set it aside. She popped open the bottle, tapped out 3 pills, and dry swallowed them before she remembered the water. Oh well, didn't matter. She shoved the bottle into her pocket. She could take more if she needed to, but she didn't think she would. She wasn't looking to OD, just numb some of the pain. She opened the straight razor, made a small snick that sounded absurdly loud, almost offensive in the pillared silence of the forest. She waited and listened. Water sifted down from the branches above, falling in big wet droplets. Some bird called, a long and mournful fluting way back in the gelid forest, the gelid cave of the forest. It really was quiet out here. All through her pregnancy, Tori had wanted to go back to that day in the car and tell Chucky to keep driving. She saw her body changing and wanted to tear her womb out of her stomach, baby and all. She looked at Chucky, good, dutiful Chucky, and wanted to claw his eyes out, forever sticking that thing inside her. I'll give it up, she told herself. I'll give it up and run away and pretend it never happened. And then after 5 hours of the worst pain she'd ever imagined, they plopped this wet, wriggling thing into her arms, this slimy, screeching creature. She looked down at it, and something blossomed, and her vision filled with an avalanche of red. Red was the color of love. Through it all, the ceaseless crying, the sleepless nights, the mess, the smells, the endless repetitions of the wheels of the bus and old MacDonald had a farm, she knew that as big a fuck-up as she had always been, she still somehow managed to do this one perfect thing. She'd made this creature with her own body. Something chattered off in the trees. Goose flesh pebbled at her shoulders and arms, and she knew the thing was back. It had followed her all the way down from the parking lot, but had stayed back, let her make her own way. But it had never left her. She looked around, blinking to clear her suddenly blurred vision. Movement, pinkish white amongst the green. Who are you? Another chatter, long and sibilant, like rocks rattling together in a paper bag. She shut her eyes, and as always she saw it all play out. The car slamming into the tiny little body, shattering bones and rupturing organs. Something red and wet hitting the windshield and spidering the glass. Brakes squealed, someone screamed. She'd been in a casino off the strip, nursing a whiskey sour and killing time at the slots before the show. Bells started clanging, a bucket full of coins spilling out of the machine, and she squealed and clapped as her son died 300 miles away from her. It was standing there now, half hidden behind the moss, and she saw she had been right. It was impossibly tall, pulled out and stretched thin like it was made of taffy. Who are you? It started gliding towards her. She should have left a note, not for the guys who gave a shit about them, but for Chucky. Chucky would wonder what he'd done wrong, what right thing he could have said to make her stop. He didn't deserve this, even though not too long ago she believed he did, because he wasn't there. He'd been in a bodega buying a pack of smokes, told Dax to wait on the curb, wasn't watching when the light turned green, and for whatever reason, Dax decided to run out into the street. He wasn't there, and he should have been. When she saw him in the funeral parlor, she pounded on his chest, tore at him, screamed at him, "Where the fuck were you?" He just blinked and licked his lips. Tori shook her head and looked down at the razor. The blade glimmered in the hazy light, and something else, her hands. She was amazed to see moss growing out of them. The thing stopped its advance. It crouched and hissed. "Come on, motherfucker," she mumbled, her voice full of thorns. "Do your worst." She tried to raise her hand, the one with the razor, so she could slash it across the opposite wrist, but something held it tight. She pulled, felt a lance of pain, and saw the vines growing out of her arms, bursting from her skin like tumors, snaking back to the log behind her. The thing skittered forward. It was so close now, inches away, but she still couldn't quite see it. It stuttered and jumped in her vision like an old film strip. She had the sense of the pinky white skin, 2 eyes like insectal orbs below the Neanderthal shelf of a brow, something long and thin like a nose. "What do you want?" It stared at her. "But I'm supposed to do this." The thing swayed on its haunches. Long nailed fingers tapped rhythmically against the dirt. "I need to do this." She felt the razor fall away and thump to the moss. Her arms were made of soggy wood. They didn't even look like arms anymore. The thing reached forward, grabbed the razor. "Don't take this away from me." The thing shook its head slowly and hissed. Something pushed out of Tori's mouth like a tongue. There was no pain. She felt it droop and rustle against her chest, glanced down and saw jade green leaves like saucers on a bramble of vines. She tasted water in her throat. Her eyes, she felt, were berries. Her hair had turned to moss. "Is this the way, then?" The thing nodded. It reached out and put a soft, cold hand on the gnarled bark of her knee. "Okay." The thing opened its mouth. No lips, no tongue, no teeth. Just black. Black like the doorway. She tried to close her eyes and felt the berries pop. Sweet nectar sluiced over the wood slope of her cheeks. Her vision filled with color, an endless field of pinkish white. In it she saw her son, her Dax, her perfect little creature, and everything was quiet. And that's it. Thanks.
Great reading there. Great reading there, Scotty.
Thank you.
How much were you thinking about the concept of liminality when you were drafting that story? And how do you see it now through the lens of liminality, if at all?
So I wasn't specifically thinking like the word liminality when I was writing it, but I was thinking, and so one thing I should say, the whole idea of pinkish white in the story, like I said, she is as a character, she experiences synesthesia, which I also do, not quite in the way that she does. And pinkish white for her is the color of grief, and so she's associating it with this creature which is following her through the woods, and also with her son. And so this obviously is a threshold that she's crossing, and there's a doorway that she experiences earlier in the story, which is also a threshold, etc. So I was thinking of doorways, thresholds, and
So you weren't thinking of it by its name, but you're thinking about it by its definition. Seems like there are 2 different kinds of liminal space, maybe even more, both actually of the physical aspects, but also the psychological, and the 2 are
and
together.
One thing that I was very specifically thinking of was the concept of grief and the concept of depression. I think of grief as a liminal space, as a sort of in the proper definition of liminal space, is a rite of passage. One thing a therapist had told me is like, there's no way through grief but through grief. There's no way through it but through. And I've also been told that about depression, and I have suffered from suicidal depression in the past. And the problem with depression, and the difference between depression and grief is, in theory, a state that you move through. You don't necessarily leave grief behind, but it is a transitional state. Depression can be a stagnant state. It is a place that you can get stuck in. And I was exploring that difference, or maybe the way grief can become depression, and how grief, if you're not careful, stagnates into depression, and that's part of what this story is about.
Depression is almost like a liminal space, not acting as a threshold, but something that should be liminal, but is
if you don't
in the danger of becoming more permanent.
Right. If you stop in the threshold, then it becomes a black hole and it pulls you in. You know, it's like the idea of like an event horizon of a black hole, and you either move beyond the event horizon or you just fall into the black hole. You know, and that's a little bit what this story is about.
Yeah, I feel like you embodied that, manifested that well in the story.
Yeah.
As much as I would talk about liminality forever, its next door neighbor is ambiguity. Ambiguity is something I talk about a lot when I talk about Strange Tales or its definition. I love to play with the definition of a strange tale. I don't think we need to pin it down because it is hard to pin down. But on the one hand, a strange tale is something we know when we see it. It's the kind of work that Robert Aikman uses, works in. Shirley Jackson. It's another hallmark of a strange tale is, and the ambiguity that we find in them is there's an intentional lack of explanation as to the supernatural element, or there could just simply be an intentional lack of explanation as to what is going on. The way I like to work with it in my work is I like to use ambiguity because I like reading and I like writing the kind of stories where it's never clear in a controlled way. Is this a psychological phenomenon that our characters are going through, or is this a supernatural phenomenon? So the next question for the panel is, how do you use ambiguity in your stories and your strange tales? And let's start off again with Rebecca on ambiguity in your fiction.
I think that there is, at least on my part, pretty purposeful ambiguity in almost every story.
Yeah.
The ones that tend to be the most straightforward are actually the ghost stories, where we have a sort of stated ghost.
Right, because those are I think you're presenting the reader that this is a supernatural ghost in most of the cases.
In most of the cases, some of them get a little more complicated or more complex, but I do love to write stories that they are sort of quiet horror. They're a bit of a slow burn. They hit that wrong note on the piano within the first couple of pages, and then we sort of go from there. So, I look up very much to Shirley Jackson, and I consider her to be one of the greats when it comes to liminal spaces and ambiguity. And again, pulling the reader in, because I don't want to spoon feed them everything. I want them to have a theory, and a great explanation to me of, the difference between an ambiguous ending and a cliffhanger that will annoy people is that with ambiguity, a reader should feel confident in their reading of the story, even if it's not the same as the person next to them. They should be fully convinced that they are right? Like I think she would do this based on all of this evidence that I am reading within this story, even if another reader would say, no, I think she would do this other thing because of all this evidence I am citing, right? That there's a confidence when you are pulled into an ambiguous story that you can feel based on your reading of it.
And both sides, there's no right and there's no wrong. Like both sides could be like, hey, X, Y, and Z, that was all in her mind.
Yep.
Hey, what about X, Y, and Z? This was all a ghost.
Bringing up the yellow wallpaper, right? Like the yellow wallpaper can be read in a few different ways, but somebody could be completely confident in saying, yep, it's the story of this.
We're going to hear from you, Reed, at the other end of this question. But before we move on, I just want to point out to our listeners. So the title of a recent work of yours is The 6 O'Clock House and Other Strange Tales. Yeah.
Yep.
So when I love this book. It was such a delight to read, and I think look, sometimes people use the word strange, and it's perhaps on face value, like, hey, these are strange tales, as in like not the term of literary art that we're talking about, that they're strange. But there's a point very early on in the book where I'm like, wait a minute, Rebecca is writing strange tales in this way, and it was such. I could point to the moment where it solidified for me. And I asked you to refresh my memory with the name of the story. It's a story in the book called Joiner, and it takes place, if I'm not mistaken, on a country club. Mm-hmm. There's ponds there. There's golf course, and you so effectively you called it the plank on the piano. It's a favorite line of mine. It's a new favorite line of mine. I want to point out in that story you're very very deftly just describing the setting. You were describing the actual lakes, and when you're describing one of them, you were like, I remember the exact language, but you're like, yeah, we're no one's really sure if this lake is man-made or if this lake is not. And no one is really sure how deep it is. And I found that was the line that really got my attention, because it's so, on the one hand, it's so innocent and so innocuous and so organically fitting into the story. But on the other hand, like, to the reader or writer of the supernatural and who's always looking for the strange tale, I was just like, whoa, there's that promise. There's that plank right there. So I just have to say bravo to that line. I love that story, and I love that line, and I feel like it uses it just used ambiguity so effectively in that line and in that story. Thank you. There. Joshua, ambiguity in fiction and ambiguity in your fiction. What are your thoughts on it?
Well, I think that ambiguity is a great tool and a wonderful thing to utilize to create some uncertainty in a story. I don't like it when it's used just for ambiguity's sake, just to make it seem like, oh, we don't know really what's going on. It seems sort of like a writer that is sort of off course and doesn't really know where to go with the story. And I think the opposite of that, someone that very much knows where to go with the story, is someone like a Robert Aickman, like Scotty brought up, particularly when it's used with a strong sense of metaphor, like the swords. I don't think there's anything ambiguous really about that story in the end, but the way he creates it and the way it unfolds and the way it ends leads you to believe that there are a lot of different interpretations you could have of it. Personally, I have one that I think is the interpretation of it, but of course, like sort of what Rebecca's saying, everybody's going to come away with it with their own interpretation.
I can't resist, because I do remember, if I'm not mistaken, we may have discussed the swords, or I may have directed you to consider reading it for one of your appearances at the New York Ghost Story Festival a few years back. I'd love to hear the way you read that ending of the short story, The Swords, because it's one of the favorites of mine. How do you see the ending?
I don't want to color anybody's thinking on it.
You're not here to color. You could just
read, but I do think that
how you see it.
I do think there are the fundamental aspect of it. I think that I pull out of it is frustrated sexuality, but something that's, what's the best way to say it? Something that's suppressed, but suppressed to the point where it's lost, and it's never going to be found. It's never going to be experienced. It's never going to actually be enjoyed, maybe in the way that these men in this dirty tent were maybe hoping to during their lives. And there's a lot of directions you can go with that, and there's more I could probably say about it. But I think Aickman's just so good at using metaphor in this way that is so eerie and so real at the same time. You can almost believe these things are really happening, despite the fact that you can't obviously put several swords into a woman and have her survive. It's just the way he does it. And, Rebecca was talking about the notion of quiet horror, or something that's quiet. He does this sort of matter-of-factly. There isn't this big build-up to this. It just, the protagonist shows up.
If you blink, you might miss it in that kind of way.
Yeah. And in fact, I think the first time I read it, I did miss it. Wait a minute, what just happened? You just kind of get lulled along with the story. Maybe there's some Englishness in that.
I think there's a huge, at least this. I think everyone does their strange tale their own way. In the case of Aickman, it is that British. It's the groundingness in the British verisimilitude and in the British reality that when when the story does slip into the uncanny valley, you never saw it coming, but suddenly you're there, and that was like the joy of Aikman and the Swords for me. And I love that you experience it as metaphor, and you're like, oh, I know the answer, and for me it's metaphor because that, yeah, how could it not be? That's totally there. And but I think the joy of the Swords is like you could show a number of different people that story, and they'll be like, oh, but it's this, or I don't know, or it could be this. And the Swords is a special story for me, or I think a special story in Aikman, who calls his story Strange Tales, because I feel like it's the one story where, and he's an author who doesn't tip his hat. He very famously, unlike all of us, refuses to his death to, he very rarely, maybe on only one or two occasions, would talk about fiction or his process. It just was a no-go. He just would not talk about it. But the Swords was one story I think he accidentally spoke about because he also was an editor, and he, something I don't like to do, he did include a reprint of the Swords in a series of ghost stories that he did. And he was a bit, I don't know if it was a curmudgeon or an egoist, but he was like, there are only, and he said there was a finite number. There are only 37 great ghost stories, and I'm publishing all of them. But he included the Swords, which is, you don't really think of it as a ghost story, in his volume of the Fontana Book of Ghost Stories. I think it was volume 4. And for a long time, it perplexed me because I'm like, wait a minute, I don't see the Swords as a ghost story. And, oh, Aikman, I wish you had published your own work. But that being said, wow, it appears that Aikman saw this story as a ghost story. And it's just fascinating to me. But I believe we're on to Scotty, tackling the subject of ambiguity in fiction.
Yeah, I agree with Joshua in that I don't like ambiguity, like stuff that's weird for the sake of weird, but I love ambiguity. I love when a story is sort of purposefully ambiguous, when I feel like there's an intention there. So that's one thing I always strive for. And so the methods I use is I will try to put as much into the subtext as possible. I try to have characters talk around things as much as I can, so that they're not like big expo dumps. It's one thing I, particularly in my screenwriting classes, I really try to teach my students to not just sort of just explain exactly, use their dialogue to explain the plot to the reader or to the audience. And then another thing I really like to do, particularly in short fiction, is kind of end before the ending as much as I can. When I can, kind of end at the crisis point or maybe right after the crisis point, so that I'll know what the actual ending of the story is, but I end just a little bit early so that like you have a sense.
Well, looks like Scotty's locked up there, but until Scotty comes back, yeah, I think ambiguity for ambiguity's sake, it could very easily be a. Hey, Scotty, are you back? But I'll finish my point just and then we'll come back to you. Is we're talking about ambiguity for ambiguity's sake. I feel like I'm using ambiguity as the not so much on its face value as like, oh, this is confusing or this is ambiguous or yeah, we're leaving it out. But ambiguity is defining something by its opposite is never a good idea. But the opposite of rules, or perhaps the opposite of the ecology of the supernatural. And I think a great way of saying that is a lot of horror fiction, they might be about the rules of the monster. Hello, this is a vampire. This is a vampire story. These are the rules or its weaknesses. These are the rules how you must defeat it. So in stories with rules, almost often they run the risk of becoming mundane or about those rules. We must get the thing. We must chop off the head. We must bury it in there. When it's ambiguous as to, is this even a vampire? Is this even a supernatural or not? We're free from the rules, even if the reader or the character is wanting them or expecting them, and it starts to become like what Rebecca was saying. Like, yeah, you have to come across that line and interact with the story. And I feel like the craftsmen, when they're using ambiguity and freeing yourself from certain sorts of mundanities and and cliches and structures, the story is free to be something else.
Mm-hmm.
And is that what we, the authors, intended? Is it even something else? I would hope that it frees the stories to be more humanistic stories and allow them to be more uniquely about character. But I think there's a whole pantheon of what ambiguity can be a threshold for. And you were saying about ambiguity before you froze up there.
Oh yeah, I was just saying, just to finish my thought, is the idea of ending before the ending is I want to make sure I have an ending in mind so that I'm not just like throwing some weird non sequitur ending in there. But I like to end a little bit early so that I'm leaving a little something on the table so that the audience or the reader can kind of fill in some blanks or leave with some questions in mind.
I love that.
But I want them to know that there's an intentionality there.
I love that structure because I feel like it allows, especially I love that you say that you know what it is, and you've stopped it at the moment. You said the moment of crisis, because now you've stopped it. I feel like that adds highlight to the conflict or the choice. I feel like that I see a lot of that in, I guess, what I call classic horror. I think a lot of horror ends with, I call it a reveal. It ends with, oh no, we're at this point and the character must make a choice, but we don't, we almost don't, or we don't see their choice, or we don't see it, like, even maybe perhaps like the ending of even though it's sort of a foregone conclusion, the ending of Pet Sematary kind of ends at that moment of just like, oh shit, we kind of know where this is going. We hope it's not, but
in movies and novels, a lot of times what they do is, they'll have the crisis point, then they'll have the climax, and then they'll throw in a second crisis point. What I love about short fiction is that
so much in
Hollywood
today,
right. It's like the classic slasher movie where it's like, he gets up at the end. But like, what's great about short fiction is like you don't even need to get to the climax. Like you can just sort of end at a crisis point. I think the classic example for me is Richard Matheson's Born of Man and Woman, where it's like, oh, the child in the basement's just about to get out of the basement and do something to the parents. It's like such a short little nugget of a story. But it's like it ends on such an ambiguous note. But you can really only do that, I think, in short fiction.
I love it.
And that's why I love, like, horror is such a great horror and weird fiction is just such a great vehicle for the short story and for the ambiguous short story.
So we're going to about to hear our second strange tale, or excerpt of a strange tale of the evening. Rebecca, will you introduce and set up the tale that you're going to read from?
Sure. So this is from my new collection, 6 O'Clock House and Other Strange Tales. And for Daniel, there's a frog on the back. And I can't see it, but it's there. I'm going to read. Thank you. I'm going to read from a story called Infested. And it is one of the newest stories that I put into the collection. And it's more about that psychological liminal space. So this is at its heart a story about the place between being traumatized and being healed, which is the painful part. I'm just going to read the first few pages because it's a little bit too long to read all of it.
Got it.
Viv noticed the first one about 2 months after she started therapy. A knee-high figure scrambling to hide behind the refrigerator. It had pigtails. It wore tie-dye. When she got up the nerve to look, it was gone, though she could hear it giggling. Maybe it had gotten into the walls like that squirrel last fall. The next one she saw was gawky and awkward. Weird long arms dangling and knobby knees full of scabby, half-healed scrapes. It ran into the dark, damp place beneath the cellar stairs, and it would not come out, though Viv tried to lure it with a trail of cheese doodles. She really got worried when she spotted a third. This one was much bigger, and she recognized it from her goth phase. It scoffed and smirked. She chased it with a broom, but just when she thought she could shoo it out the back door, it juked left and ran upstairs. She heard the closet door slam. It was probably going to burn incense and smoke clove cigarettes in there, and Viv's clothes would stink like fermented hippies. Afterward, A fourth showed, and then a fifth and a sixth, wearing all the bad hairstyles she'd ever tried, all the horrid clothes she'd thought could remake her. The mini skirts that left her ass hanging out, and the baggy hoodies she wore like tents. She lost count after 12. They crept behind her and scattered when she whirled to face them. They skittered like roaches hiding from the light. Sometimes she felt one breathing down the back of her neck, and if she gave it the satisfaction of screaming, it would run away laughing, shrieking, "I got her," in her own voice. All those messy, wretched former selves Viv had tried to forget. The drunken one tripping over its own feet in the kitchen. The one that sobbed all night in the spare bedroom so loud Viv couldn't sleep. She banged on the wall, and that self banged back and cried louder out of spite. There was a violent one, too, angry all the time. Its twisted face was almost unrecognizable as her own, and it often pinched Viv so hard that blood blisters formed on her thighs and the backs of her arms. She begged it to stop, but it just laughed its mean laugh and sauntered away. They became a bigger problem as days stretched to weeks. They ate her food, and they used all her expensive shampoo. They spilled red wine on the carpet and stuck gum between the couch cushions, rented X-rated pay-per-view movies, and bought jewelry from the home shopping network with her credit card. They pulled her hair and clung to her legs and mismatched all of her socks. They licked the doorknobs and chewed her shoes like hyper puppies. She hated them, and she wanted them gone. Her therapist was no help, Dr. Agda. When Viv had told her about the infestation, she said, in her voice that was always an octave more chipper than called for, "The only way out is through, Vivian. You're doing the work, but it's a process." And Viv said, okay, though she didn't really believe her. And they did another session, but that only brought another rogue self, this time from the future. Bagged skin and age spots, muttering, "Where is Thomas? Where is Thomas?" Viv didn't know anyone named Thomas. So Viv canceled her next appointment. She wouldn't invite more of those horrible things. She wouldn't make it worse. Already, her little house was overrun, and she missed deadlines at work. When she forgot about an important meeting with a client company at the ad agency, her boss told her to take some time off. Viv said no. Her boss said it was forced vacation or suspension, her choice. Viv took the vacation days. She tried poison first. She bought a dozen donuts and shook on some crystallized rat poison that blended in with the sprinkles. She left the box on the kitchen table, took a seat, and waited. The toddler self came out from behind the fridge and sniffed the air. It clutched a raggedy stuffed elephant to its chest and had dried snot on its shirt. At first, Viv thought, do it, eat it. One down is one gone. And the little thing did reach for one, the biggest one with the most sprinkles, and it brought the donut closer to its mouth. But before it could take a bite, Viv slapped the tainted food out of the thing's tiny hand. It wailed and ran, retreating to its hidey hole. Viv hung her head and cried. Then she straightened up and threw away the donuts, kicking the trash can after she banged the lid closed. She couldn't even kill one pesky little invader. She was soft. She was a coward and a quitter. Disgusted, she went to bed. She didn't get up until well into the next afternoon. She thought next of what people did when they wanted vermin gone, but didn't have the stomach to kill them. Humane traps. The local hardware store didn't sell anything big enough, just little sizes to trap chipmunks and mice, the next size up for squirrels and groundhogs. But online, she found one made for trapping, among other things, stray dogs, feral hogs, and bobcats. Viv paid for express delivery. 2 days later, the trap was set and ready in the living room, an open bottle of Cabernet inside for bait. She would probably catch the drunk self first. She knew how much it liked red wine. It had the purple teeth and stained clothing to prove it. To sweeten the pot, she added a Nirvana CD and a bag of peanut M&Ms. Then she ducked behind the couch. But that space was already occupied. Viv found herself crouching next to her teen self, black lipstick smeared and crooked eyeliner making it look like a mime in the rain. That self used to light paper towel dispensers on fire in the school bathrooms with a shoplifted Zippo. It stole from classmates' lockers and threw the loot in the ditch behind the soccer field because it never really wanted what it took. The teen self smirked. "Nice shirt," it said. "Makes you look like a cartoon bee." Viv ignored it. She didn't point out that its ripped fishnets were cliched. She just stared at her hands clasped over her knees, a knot in her stomach, wanting to catch one of the assholes and also not sure what she'd do with it if she did. Could she just set it free out by the airport? If she didn't take it far enough, it would only find its way back. Then came a loud click and a snap and a howl of pain. Viv jumped up. It was the sad one from upstairs. It had tried to crawl just partway in, reaching for the goodies, and the trap had snapped closed on its ankle. Blood dripped. The thing howled again. Viv made the mistake of looking at its face. Her, at about 25, probably just after Mike had left her. Its face was puffy, eyes tortured, wet orbs. "Oh no," said Viv. She got up and pried the trap open. The self that had gotten stuck there shuttled backward, but before it could hobble away, Viv said, "Wait." She reached in and got the M&Ms, handed them to that self, and tugged it toward the bathroom by its too thin wrist. She sat it down on the edge of the tub. She said, "Let me see." The thing was scared, but it gave Viv its foot. Blood smeared onto Viv's pajama pants. "I'm sorry," said Viv. "I just don't know what to do. I'm sorry, okay? I'm just sorry." The self sitting on the tub kept crying and did not respond. Viv reached under the sink, rustled around, found antibiotic ointment and bandages. None was big enough, so she thought to make an anklet of 6 of them, stuck on perpendicular to the deep cut, making sure it was covered after she'd cleaned it with a soapy washcloth, satisfied it wouldn't get infected. By the time she was done, that self had stopped crying. Viv looked up from her first aid job. The sad self was shoving M&Ms into its mouth by the handful. So many, Viv was surprised it didn't choke. It held out the bag to her and shook it a little. An invitation, an offer. "Thanks," said Viv, and took a few. They sat together until they had polished off the bag. The self didn't talk, but Viv did. "You're better off," she said, still chewing. "Really. Do you know who he married? His third cousin, Amber? Yeah, we met her at a family reunion. I'm serious. And remember how much he talked about fantasy football? Like, all the time. And he had that gross friend, Sid, who came over every weekend? The one whose ass crack always hung out. Please, don't be sad. Not over him." The self sitting on the edge of the tub was smiling by then, just a little, and Viv smiled back. And then she laughed, and that self laughed too. And just when tears pricked her eyes, because it was so stupid, whoever got sad about someone like Mike, it was so dumb. The self across from her faded like fog in sunlight. "No," Viv said, but she didn't know why she said that. And she reached out to grab its hand, but her hand closed on the empty candy bag, and she was alone in the bathroom. "One down then," Viv said, and she didn't know why she wasn't happier. And I'm going to stop there.
It's such an effective story.
Thank you.
That your collection has such such depth to it. So many amazing strange tales. What I love about that story is how her space becomes the liminal space, and just the psychology of it. Just it's handled so perfectly. That psychological aspect of it, and it's so unsettling with the toddler. Like she's luring the toddler. It's so unsettling, but it just perfectly works, like within the expectations of the story. And you feel like when I first read that story, it had such verisimilitude to it, where I felt like you almost feel like a voyeur for watching it. You're like, oh wow, like it felt so psychologically true that you're just like, wow, I'm seeing this. So and you were shining a light on it as the author, and man, that's no easy task. So bravo, great reading, and bravo to that story.
Thank you.
It really, and it also is a great transition. We're running over on time, so we're going to go right to our final topic, which is sense of place in strange tales. And I want to mention one of Joshua's stories, and he's going to be our next reader. In if you could hold up your book again, Joshua, to haunted Victorian America. One of my favorites that you're in that book is called, if I'm not mistaken, it's called The Boarding House, and it has such a wonderful sense. All the stories in there have such a wonderful sense of place, but this one, called The Boarding House, not only has a sense of the illusion, as best we can, of being in those Victorian times. It has this wonderful, very Aikman-esque liminal space of the boarding house in there that is just so it really embodies a lot of what we're talking about. Like at some point in the narration of that story, we've switched to like, wow, is this real? Is this psychological? Is this supernatural? And all of that ambiguity, as you mentioned, it serves the theme of your book, and I believe one of the themes of the book is to shine a light on the plight of the people, and most often the plight of women in the Victorian age, and the boarding house. I feel like it just really captures all of those. What were you thinking when you drafted the boarding house? Were you thinking about liminality or those concepts in addition to the Victorian aspects of it?
Well, thank you, Daniel, for saying that. I just wanted to do a quick aside. One thing that I really enjoyed about both Scotty and Rebecca's stories is this notion of the characters like seeking relief. And it's like they're on the precipice, willing to self-sacrifice themselves in order to get that. And that journey to that place, I think, is a dark journey, but that attempt to ascertain relief is a really heroic journey, a really courageous thing to do. So I just noticed that thread between both your stories. I really enjoyed.
There's a lot of synchronicities between the two stories of the blackness and that place of grief.
Yeah, I love how Rebecca was saying, "Why didn't I feel better?" You know what I mean? Why, after this, am I not feeling better? Sometimes it's just not found. But with the boarding house. So just a little context for this collection. It takes place between, really within the parameters of the Victorian era, which really encapsulates Queen Victoria's reign, so 1837 to 1901. Some historians will back that up a bit, and they might expand that. Some take it all the way to World War I, just depending on your interpretation of it. I cleave to those dates pretty strongly because by the time 1901 happens, we have cars and planes are almost coming, and there's the Edwardian age, and it just ushers in the progressive era, and there are a lot of things that happen that sort of delineate that. But with the boarding house, it takes place in the mid-century, and it's about a songwriter and his family, and the songwriter is having a hard time making a living, really, at this point. And they get sort of kicked out of one boarding house, and they manage to find this other while they're walking through the snow and probably going to freeze to death, and they find this place, and the matron welcomes them in, and there's this immediate feeling of separation that's going on here, where the women are sort of their own little enclave in this place, where the men are these genius artists that are all on their own level, and the women must respect that they're up there creating their art and they're doing their thing, and you must not interrupt them. And a lot of this stems from this notion of Victorian notion called the cult of domesticity, or the cult of true womanhood, where the woman's task was to be the angel of the home. You know, you have this notion of mother, home, and heaven. That was the great triumvirate. And her task is to create this wonderful, warm, loving home for the family, and to do all the chores of the home, while the man goes out and he's the public-facing figure. He's the one that earns the money. He's the citizenship representation. And so you have this this real defined split, this cleave. And, you know, what does this leave women with? Well, there are a lot of ambitious women that would maybe want to be politicians, and there were, or wanted to be successful writers in their own right. There are a lot of them that are taking male names. Look at the Bronte sisters, in order to be respected for their work, because otherwise, if they're women, they're just women writing this. So the boarding house plays off of a lot of that, and the protagonist in particular, she's looking for a way out of this, and she manages to find it through this really cluttered cellar. Which I won't really get into much more detail in case somebody wants to read it. But yeah, I think there's some liminal aspects to that for sure. And you know, finding that middle path, sometimes maybe liminality is the answer.
Yeah, I feel like you did that story. You did a wonderful job of putting into dramatic structure to the layman such as myself, who may not have been thinking as much about it. All the cages that people in the Victorian age found themselves in, particularly that triumvirate of what women were going through, and you manifested it so well in dramatic structure, both those cages that people find themselves in, and the cages that whole classes of people would put in, and the cages of the age, and also bringing up that concept of liminality, of the space, of that. It is a space. It is an in between, but I feel like it really, despite it being a liminal space or an in between space, it really had a sense of motion in the story, of a sense that that the Victorian age was something that would be passed through and that wasn't forever. And yeah, I found it was a really effective story. How do you use sense of place? What's the name of the story that you're going to read from for us in just a bit, Joshua?
It's called The Caretaker, and it's the last story in Haunted Victorian America. So these stories, there's representation for each decade from the 1830s up until 1901. And so this takes place in 1901. So it's the end of the Victorian era, and that's significant. Well, hopefully it'll become apparently significant why it's happening in it. It has to do with an old Victorian house that's about to collapse, and what that means for the people that are left there, or the remnants of the people that are left there.
Let's turn it over to you and hear from that story.
All right. The Caretaker, 1901. When is the caretaker coming? The 8 are gathered around the black table in a room dressed in black damask walls, black velvet curtains, black painted Gothic Revival furniture, black marble mantle, black leather books, black rugs, doors and walls that are black, paintings mostly of night scenes with only slashes of red, distant fire, bloodline of disappearing sun, blood moon leaking blood light upon ink spill harbors, rivers, clusters of jagged tree tangle. Wordless due to lack of light is this scene. Or rather, there are shadow letters, or perhaps they are shapes that resembled letters, shapes that say nothing but suggest sharpness. These defined by the 8's spectral candles. Each carry one of these candles, fireless but full of yellow-white light. A glowing stem, a cold flame, soul candles. Without these, where would they be in this decided darkness? The 8 are inhabitants of 8 rooms for 8 deaths. Each, the rooms, personal universes in which the entirety of their lives are rolled like canvases or tapestries, to be unfurled upon the walls and panels and regarded and rewound again diurnally. And each night, after their days of personal lookings and regrettings and relovings and relongings and mournings and celebrations, these inhabitants assess the slow, steady decay of the tangible place upon which their previous lives are projected, and then descend to the room with all the black, and there sit and join hands and project their hands onto the planchette pointed in the arc of letters and say, "When is the caretaker coming?" And always there is no answer. The wind, sometimes the rain, but no answer. The houseflies, the howls, the distant trains ever faster, mechanical, artificial voices, but no actual answer. No feet, no weight upon the steps of the warped veranda, no approach. No one comes. What will we do if the house falls? Outside, the house is a dark shape on a long, empty plot, an artful bloom of shadow from the hairy ground, an intentional form, a manipulation of elements and materials, a system of slender dowels, sawn brackets, stone block, plaster and lime, iron nails, paint, grease and oils and soot and stain, horizontal and angled and vertical sheathing and stick and clapboard, dormers, a series of hoods along the slouching roof, flat glass eyes, some shattered, catching lightning light, wind finding its way within the house, wind scrape and thrust, wind disheveling, wind seeking and stirring with impunity, wind that wants back the formed elements to deform what is/was formed. S equals K log W is Boltzmann's equation. It means all systems are moving toward disorder. This is something known by the time of the date in this story, the year of this house's end story, a story that could end 8 stories if indeed the house collapses. And there is, to be sure, cause for alarm among its occupants. The woodwork is wormed, the fine wallpaper is peeling, the curling downward in sheets, the lincrusta is desiccated and crackled, the staircase sags, the ceiling plaster lays upon the floor in some of the occupants' rooms. The ceiling plaster is like wet bread. The dust is color smothering. The window panes are split with light-bending crack lines. The door handles are frozen with rust. The chimneys are stuffed with soot and feathers and small animal skeletons and dirt, and all of this water compacted. Compaction. All is drawn down, 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 decay, drag. There are forces that act upon the structure. The house that houses their spooled former lives and spirit candle post-lives. The house stands in situ, without agency, letting these things happen because it did not raise itself and cannot raise itself. Who will preserve us? The 8 occupants know that there is only so much repetition, only so many replays, like their lives. Their afterlives contain only so many days, tied to the house as they are. Only so much the house can sustain without a caretaker. There are many mundane minutes where the richest of all the 8's memories reside, these which become most saturated with experience, long expanses of time and routine. But are they worth preserving? These repetitions, these mundane minutes? Each of the 8 ponders this during the current shapeless minutes. There is only so much energy. Ergo, what energy is required in order to replay moments that are inconsequential despite their treasured personal beauty? What does it take to maintain the color of memory, to brighten and to blur it? Music memory and smell memory, chemical thread memory, connection, to bind this all together, the facsimiles and shadows of neural knots? What is the date? A new century, a new urgency. What do they do now that their century has ended? The decades are getting far. 1901, 1901. 1850 feels far, and it looks far. They, the 8, look far from even their perceptions of themselves. Their personal watchings of their previous lives feel immediate. while they are watching them, but they see in one another, in the house, in the lack of the arrival of the caretaker, that time is a series of light and dark cycles and nothing else. Maybe just dark. Maybe the light is merely aberration, illuminating the inevitable emptiness, a temporary graying. One thing is for certain, nostalgia is a prison, a penitentiary created by style. Who will remember us? The 8 sit at the table in their old clothes with their soul candles before them, self-projections in this room, onto this room, remains of light, light traveling still, light still reaching and laying upon matter, despite the matter of the light's origin being itself long devoid of life-light. Projections projecting themselves, though no one is there to see them. Their corporeal forms long devoured by the ground into which the house is being drawn, with no caretaker to keep this from happening. There is an invisible pit into which the house will go, a proverbial pit, a metaphorical pit. No pit will actually open. The corpse of the house will be allowed to remain visible in all its rot. The rot translates to shame, but nothing should be embarrassed by its own rotting. Who will remember us? Is there an obligation of one material to contain the evidence of another? Is it burden? Is it slavery? Is it necessity? Is the notion irrelevant? How much space should be permitted to retain that which no longer lives? What determines when something is no longer living? What value is there in then? Who will remember us? One of the 8 soul candles begins to dim. He stands, walks to the front door, waiting for the caretaker. The caretaker must be coming, he supposes. He has to be coming. The 7 continue their seance, their summoning of a caretaker, and when at length another rises to go and search for the man, she finds he is no longer at the door. And so they are 7 then. They have always been 7, they decide, for none of them can recall the man in any detail. Who will remember us? They ask the board with the letters on it, but it is just a board. Just a square of pressed materials curling at the edges, warping and bulging, inert to summons and spells, neither possessing them nor possessing the capacity to be possessed by them. The house collapses on the left side during the summer of 1901, on the non-black room side, erasing 3 of the universes. They are not recorded and do not rise. They are just, in the few words, no more. Sunlight descends into the staircase now during the day. A stairway to light, to nowhere. But the wind is everywhere, all day and all night. When they come to the table again, they are 4. They have always been 4, they decide. But why are there 8 chairs? Who provided these? Was it someone? The light of the soul candle shines blue-white upon the black things and the black wall and floor coverings. The light is dimmer because there are less of them. Less warm, always less warm, this light. A brightening, but a colding. The light begins to show them that black is really violet. Deep blue violet, or paling gray, an ever white gray. The 4 had not noticed this before. The light in their memory reels is increasingly similar. It is light that instantiates decay, that subtracts color, mood, story, accuracy. The light is a lie that absorbs their neural film like digestive acids. And in the hours left before the house falls, without their memories and with the caretaker never arriving, their individual lights begin to swell and blend into one another. They are 4, they are 3, they are 2, then they are 1. One light, bright as supernova. A final expanding swell. Soon they cannot see anything but this, their own blindingly incandescent light, exploding in a bright burst of former form and meeting. A great, bright and tangled arc. Substantiation. Proof of the cascading, coruscating shape of love before eternal disorder.
Great reading, Joshua. I absolutely adore that story. It's a fantastic, effective story, and it's so wonderfully. It's a wonderful conclusion to your volume of. I'm so enthusiastic about your book. It's such a, it's so unique. It's such an accomplished volume of ghost stories. Yeah, I really. If you haven't picked up this book, I do hope. I do hope that you pick it up. I was delighted to see just a book of not only just a book of ghost stories, but it's a book of historical fiction and it's a book of ghost stories. So it's really unique and really effective in that. Just really bravo. Well done, Joshua.
Thank you so much, Daniel. I appreciate that.
Yeah. We are. I have so much more that I want to talk about with this wonderful panel, but we are out of time. I want to make sure we keep a second just to to thank our viewers who are writing "This is gold." They're writing clap in the comment section. So the viewers are thanking you to our panel. I'll start with my shout outs and then we'll move through the panel where you can connect with them and connect with their work. I wanted to. First and foremost, mention, even though the man is right here with us, Scotty is fantastic, has been a fantastic supporter of this show. So we just want to make sure that you do check out Scotty's podcast, Horror from the High Desert. It really is such the gold standard in my eyes of horror fiction and horror film podcasts because Scotty goes really in depth. He has such a wide variety of guests from week after week. So do check out the show notes and do connect if you have not already with his podcast, Horror from the High Desert. I want to mention that I have a new book out, Creatures of Liminal Space. You can connect with that over at Jackanapes Press. That's the publisher. You can get different editions of that over there at Jackanapes Press. Or you can get it. It's now live. It just launched over on Amazon. I'm told soon you can also get the book at Word Horde Emporium of the Weird, I believe it's called, Word Horde Emporium of the Weird. That's Ross Lockhart's store over in Petaluma, California. So you could ask for the book there. And while you're at it, why not ask for books from all three of our guests there? See if they stock the book, or I'm sure they can if they don't already stock it. And the last two plugs I want to mention is join us for the next Nighttime Logic is July the 24th. My guests will join me for a conversation and readings about the horrific. And the three guests will be Phil Fracassi, Jonathan Jans, and Dan Franklin. But before then, on July 15th, we're going to do a virtual launch of Creatures of Liminal Space right here on this channel. So you can hit like, you can hit subscribe, or connect with me and join us for that. Joshua, where can people connect with you, and where can they pick up a copy of your latest volume?
Through my website, joshuarex.com is probably the best place. And you can find all my links to social media on there. And the book is also available on Amazon. Fantastic.
And Scotty, where can people connect with you? Where can they connect with Horror from the High Desert and connect with some of your projects?
So my website, scottymilder.com. You can find all my social media links there. Also Instagram, Facebook, all the places. Horror from the High Desert got a new episode coming out tomorrow. My guest is Jeremy Wagner, talking about some of his fiction and his music. He's also a very accomplished death metal guitarist, so that'll be fun. I don't have a book out, but you can find all links to all the anthologies and magazines I've been in on my website. So scottymilder.com. So
and I put a link to I believe where you can find the story you're reading from in the show notes as well. And where can people connect with you and your work, Rebecca?
So the best place to go to is probably Linktree/Rebecca Cuthbert Writes. You can go to my website. There are links to free stories, and then there are links to books and social media and all kinds of other stuff. And the book that I read from tonight, again, is 6 O'Clock House and Other Strange Tales, and that is through Water Tower Hill Publishing. So you can go to the publisher's website, you can go to Barnes & Noble, you can go to Amazon for copies, and there are hardcovers, paperbacks, or ebooks available for that one. And I also wanted to plug really quick that in the fall, I have a new collection of ghost stories coming out called The Hauntings Back Home.
Exciting.
And thanks. And it's got the foreword by Jonathan Gensler, plus a bonus 13th story by Gensler as well. And that's coming out through Undertaker Books.
Lucky 13, the 13th story. Another volume of ghost stories. It's just music to my ears. It's so exciting. Thank you so much for everyone for joining us. And again, thank you to Joshua, Scotty, and Rebecca. What a great panel. Really enjoy your work. What a great conversation. And we'll hope to see you again on the show soon.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Take care. Enjoy the summer.
Thank
And
you.
we'll see you again soon. Take care, everyone.
Bye-bye.